Hey, welcome back to PsychoBible. I'm Andrew Rodriguez. Thanks for coming in and joining me here. I'm just going to jump right into it. In this video, I want to really just explore some of my thoughts about the culture war and how modernism and postmodernism and religion fit into it all. So, when I was getting into YouTube back in 2016, I was noticing some trends that that were really peculiar for me because coming out of grad school just a couple of years prior and really burnt from some of my experiences, and then when you're in the psych program, you always have to take a multicultural counseling course, and you're pretty much fed a a good dose of education on microaggressions and privilege and um, just the current leftist narrative on things. And it sort of made me think that this is what all intelligentsia and academia is thinking. And I wasn't really big on YouTube at that point. I was mostly just watching a lot of uh, film videos and movie reviews, things like that. But I started to, I think it was with Jordan Peterson, and when I was introduced to him, I just opened up this whole world to all these other YouTube channels and videos out there going against the narrative that I was inundated with in grad school. So I was noticing some things because what I'm used to is that academia is staunchly atheist and secular, and you're seeing the intellectuals now starting to find themselves allying with Christians. I was noticing this in some of the comment threads, even in one comment thread I read, and most of this is in reaction to how far the left is going, to the point where the postmodernists were now attacking science, particularly via the issue of transgenderism. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it's a transgender issue that has been kind of the straw that's breaking the camel's back, and rational people are starting to be like, okay, I think we're going a little too far. One thing, we're liberal, we want people to just be free to do what they like, and we don't want to enforce a particular worldview on people. But the transgender issue, there's people on the left and the liberals and rational people are starting to realize, I think we're going a bit too far here. And I don't think that it's any coincidence or it's arbitrary that it's the transgender issue that has led to that. That's a video for another time, because I got a whole other train of thought about that stuff. So anyway, it's through that you start to see now science being attacked. And so seeing some of the comment threads, atheists saying, actually apologize. There's one commenter said, okay, Christians, you're right. Can we just get past our differences a bit so we can unite against this postmodern threat to our civilization? And that was just fascinating to see this development. And as this whole, especially the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, as this has sort of unraveled, you're starting to see people who were normally very adverse to religion and Christianity now starting to see some value in it and reconsider their worldview and be willing to start going to church again, or not treat Christians like they're idiots. And see, maybe their traditions have some value and actually some meaning. So this is what has been happening over the past couple of years, and I've been trying to inform my fellow Christians at church about it and tell them, hey, there's some stuff going on in the culture, maybe not in the mainstream yet, but it's on the fringes and it's in academia, or more likely it's in what we now call the intellectual dark web, the people online who are intelligent and maybe not seated academics or professors at universities, but they have stuff to say, and they're having these discussions that is largely being ignored by the larger culture. And so there's something changing, at least at this level. Maybe not the everyday person level or the level at the college where people are getting most of their indoctrination, but there's something happening. So I've been trying to inform people of this as it's been developing, and it's just been fascinating to me. So there was an interview on the Rubin report with Dave Rubin with both Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro that came out, I think, last week. And I really love this interview. They get into some really good topics, and you can actually, there's one section I want to focus in on because it really gets to my thesis that I've been actually, in some of the comments and other videos, I've put this out there. And the thesis is that what we're seeing at the radical left, it was inevitable. It is the inevitable progression of secular modernism. So, and that's why it's like the left is now eating its own. We've been noticing that as well. Well, this was inevitable. Of course, it was going to lead to this. And so I want to develop that thought a bit. So let me play the clip in question and just watch the whole interview. I'll provide the link in the description. Watch that whole interview. Also, check out Paul Vanderklay's channel. He does an analysis, or a couple videos on the later sections of this whole interview, which I'm not going to comment and make my own video because Paul does an amazing job on his own with that. So definitely check out his commentary. But I wanted to comment on, it's actually the conversation right before the section that Paul starts commenting on when they get into discussion of God and really fleshes out Jordan Peterson's views on God. But there's a discussion about how Christianity is what undergirds our modern civilization in the West and how that foundation has been eroding. And so let me start with that section.
And it was interesting. I did an interview with Tucker Carlson, who I know is in here with you also. And one of the things that we talked about was, what people should do in dying towns. They're in areas where the industry has left. What should they do? They're experiencing difficulty. And I was saying that telling people that the jobs are coming back falsely is not going to actually do anything for them. That the only thing that you're guaranteed in America or in a free country is the adventure, right? That's what you're guaranteed. Yeah. And that's also what makes life meaningful, is that sense of adventure. That's what America was built on, right? That's the fundamental command, the very first command that Abraham has ever given is get up, leave the land of your fathers where you're comfortable, and go someplace where I'm not even going to tell you where you're going. You're just going to go there, and then when you get there, maybe you'll know, right? And that's. But I think that one of the areas, Jordan, where you and I think it would be interesting to drill down is when it comes to directing toward the purpose. How do we define what the purpose is? Because I think one of the things that's been difficult in the West, at least since the death of the Judeo-Christian value system in many ways, or at least we're running on the fumes of the Judeo-Christian value system is the truth. But since the decline of the importance in many people's minds of that value system, the decline of biblical living, has been this idea you can create your own meaning. Yeah, right. You just that if you find something that you truly care about and then you pursue that thing that you truly care about, this will bring you happiness. And that may be true for a certain number of people, but the vast majority of people are incredibly crappy at coming up with their own meanings. Yeah. There has to be something that is out there that is discoverable in order for it to be discovered. I think
that's what the psychoanalysts, that's why I like Jung so much, because that's what made him such an astute critic of Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche believed we had to create our own values. But the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, started to note that the values were actually built in. And Freud saw that, first of all, in dreams, right? And then Jung took that apart and associated the dreams with the myths and said, no, you don't understand, is that the values are built in. You don't create them, you can rediscover them. And that's the resurrection of the Father from the belly of the beast.
This does raise a question as to, and you and I have discussed this before, is where exactly that moral system comes from. So Kant obviously talks about the idea that he believes in God because of the starry sky above and the moral law within. Yeah, you can discover all this within. I am not convinced that human beings can actually discover meaning within, because if that were true, then the prosperity and liberalism and human rights and value for individuals and all the things that we associate with the good stuff in the West, that would have been universal. And it is not, in fact, universal. It arose at a certain time in a particular place associated with a particular value system. This is why when people ask me about why I think that revelation is necessary, why it's important, it's because I think that without, you're going to have to make these fundamental assumptions. To get from point A to point B, you're going to have to make fundamental assumptions at point A. Now, you can either get that from revelation, or you can just assume it, and then try to explain where those assumptions came from, or you can just pretend those assumptions don't exist, which is, I think, actually what Sam sort of does. And I hate to criticize Sam in his absence, but I think that Sam sort of just assumes that when he says things like, we're here for the greater flourishing of human beings.
Yeah.
You actually have to define every one of those terms. There are a bunch of assumptions baked into what all of that means that he's making, and I'm not sure that Sam will acknowledge he's making them. But that's why, to me, and this is sort of thesis of my book next year, the West is built on the basic revelations of Jerusalem, meaning human beings are made in God's image with individual value and with individual purpose and with a collective purpose where we get together and we pursue living in a more virtuous way. And that's one pole. And the other pole is the reason of Greece, where we have the capacity to look at the world around us and draw conclusions from that world. And on those poles are built all of modern science, are built all of economics, are built the free speech and free lives that we live right now. And I think that we have been gradually, over the last 200 years, chipping away at both of those poles, Jerusalem in terms of revelation and Athens in terms of reason, which we've abandoned for postmodernism, and that's just deprived us of purpose.
So in a weird way, is this the failure of the Enlightenment liberals? All the people that I grew up loving and caring about.
All right, that was a key moment when Dave Rubin, who, if you don't know much about Dave Rubin, he was one of the Young Turks. He, which is a very far left. I don't know, they're not really journalists, but they're like commentators, and he's apparently a comedian. I've never seen any of his stand-up. His interview, he does great interviews, but he never really cracks any actual jokes. So I don't know how funny he actually is. He's also homosexual, and he's married to a man, and he comes from an atheist background, still atheist as far as I know. So he represents the left, but as he was noticing things in the culture war and the left getting way more radical and against free speech, he's like, things are going, this is not going the direction that I agree with. And he sort of got an awakening. And I think it was, if you watch enough of his videos, you'll see it was Larry Elder who sort of shattered some of his leftist narrative when it came to like police brutality of black people. So it helped him rethink some things. And so now he would say he's liberal, but more like a classic liberal. He would probably say he's more of a libertarian now. So anyway, that's Dave Rubin's background, okay? And he's hitting the nail on the head right here. This is what I've been trying to say to people. So it's awesome that his eyes are being awakened to this. And as these two are talking, Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, you can see the lights are going on even more in Dave Rubin, that he's having a bit of a struggle because as an atheist, they're talking about the importance of Christianity and belief in God. And as we continue watching, you'll see he's finding some tension within himself, I think. So who knows what God is doing in his heart.
The people that I still admire, and this little sliver of liberals that still remain, that haven't bought into leftist dogma, but that aren't necessarily religious per se or believe in these stories, but really they believe it comes from the Enlightenment period.
I think that's a good observation.
So that this is sort of their failure. I'm not blaming
It's
them.
their arrogance, I would say.
I love what Jordan Peterson just puts there. It's their arrogance. I'm going to harken back to that a little later with another clip. So.
Because even people
because
like
there's not enough in the secular world to fight this new religion.
No,
that's where I'm sort of finding myself right now, which is an incredibly uncomfortable place. I come from a much more atheist perspective, obviously, than you, and certainly where you are. Yeah. And yet I can see what the future is now. And it's like, there's nothing left over there. And we do need some fundamental truths. That's just the position that I've been
You can't have the Enlightenment
into.
without the mythos underneath it.
Exactly.
You see,
so this is where you and Sam disagree,
and also
right?
with where I disagree with people like Steven Pinker.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm an Enlightenment guy, but the thing is that when I look backwards in time, you know, what people like Harris and Pinker attribute to the Enlightenment, I see as the Enlightenment being the latest flowering of a process that was indescribably older than that.
This is exactly right.
And in the historical sense, certainly grounded in the religious traditions, but and then from my perspective, grounded in something that's biological, that's far deeper than that, like our true proclivity towards admiration for competence and reciprocity. And I do think that has to be socialized, back to your point. So one of the things Dave mentioned before we started this was that we could have a bit of a conversation about the difference between Judaism and Christianity in terms of...
I'd love to get to that. I just want to make one comment on the Neo-Enlightenment stuff. So, I mean, I will say that there is a full chapter in my book that is specifically about the views of a lot of people who I love, Sam and Michael Shermer and Pinker and the whole Neo-Enlightenment strain of thought that I think kind of includes Jonah Goldberg on the conservative side.
Yeah. And I love these guys, and I feel, intellectually, I feel more comfortable with that position, but I realize I'm just being whittled away. I think it can't hold much longer.
So here's my basic view and my basic thesis, is that there are two views of the Enlightenment. One is that, in Jonah Goldberg's words, it was the miracle. That it kind of sprang from nowhere. Suddenly, reason dominated over revelation, and it crushed revelation. And in the wake of that crushing came the full flowering of economics and humanity and freedom and liberalism.
And that those things were opposed. Reason and revelation were opposed.
Exactly. These were, and not only that they weren't in tension, they were fulsomely opposed. Because there's truth that reason and revelation are in tension, but it is also true that certain assumptions undergird the assumptions of reason. Yes. In order for you to believe that reason exists and isn't just an evolutionarily favorable firing of neurons, then you have to. I think that Sam's position that objective truth exists in the absence of anything remotely approaching a system of assumptions is unsupportable. It's completely unsupportable. I think that because you are built to create more little copies of you. Right? I mean, this is evolutionarily speaking what you are created to do. How that has to do with discovering objective truth is utterly beyond me. And what it has to do with the existence of objective truth. In any case, the Enlightenment is based on certain fundamental assumptions. It's based on the idea that you can act as an individual freely by making rational decisions in a predictable world of laws, right? Every one of those assumptions is ungrounded in a world of pure scientific determinism. It just doesn't exist. So the Enlightenment actually ate itself. The Enlightenment ate itself. What happened is that the Enlightenment was, and I think that you see this in Kant, Kant sees all of this. He sees that this struggle is coming, and so he attempts to re-inject religion and spirituality and God back into a moral system without actually saying so, right? Kant is not actually an atheist. Kant is actually trying to create a rational basis for Christian revelation and Christian reasoning so that he can avoid the trap of having to cite the Bible, but he can say that all of this makes sense anyway.
Well, that's why I see this as the failure of the modern liberals, because it's like, even with some of our IDW crew, that most of these people, most of us, come from the left originally. And it's like, well, the position we're at now is there's no one on the left that will talk to any of us without attacking us or doing any of the usual tricks. Now we've got all of these people like you and Prager and the rest of them that are willing to talk to us, willing to debate, all of this. And I still see a hesitancy because people, it's so sort of built into people that conservatives are evil, or that even thinking about the world through a religious lens or anything like that is somehow evil or dumb or something like that. And it's like, I just can't play by that game anymore.
I think that the
So I'll stop right there. I could just play more and more, but he hits, like I said, he hits the nail on the head, and it's true that if you look at the people that are at least the upper echelon of the intellectual dark web, you got Sam Harris, celebrity atheist, as some people call him. You've got Bret Weinstein and his brother Eric Weinstein. You've got Douglas Murray and Michael Shermer. You've got Jordan Peterson. He's still trying to figure out what he really believes. We're trying to figure out what he believes, and he's still trying to figure out what he believes. So we would say he's maybe more of an open agnostic with deep appreciation for Christianity. And then the only one who's like the most overtly religious would be Ben Shapiro. So, and the only one that I would say is full-on conservative as well would be him. Whereas the others are either, like, Peterson's probably the most centrist of all of that group. The rest are very liberal or left. They like to make the distinction now between the left and liberal, because the left has become kind of totalitarian. So, but it's true that the intellectual dark web, as we're calling it, has been formed out of liberals who now are being cast out of their home by the radical left, and has been eating their own. And so what you're seeing is the liberals who ran the show, as far as when it came to academia or in the intellectual community, the ones who had all the clout before, they're noticing now that they've been dethroned, and they're now pretty much in the same boat as us conservatives and religious intellectuals that never were given time of day, and they're trying to gain back their territory, really, is what's happening in some ways. So this was one of my concerns with, say, Pangburn philosophy. And that's interesting that just imploded. So Pangburn, that was a venture of this. I don't know too much about him. His name is Travis Pangburn. I think he's just an atheist. I don't know a whole lot about him. And he had organized the 4-part debate or discussion between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. And then he had a bunch of other panel discussions with people like Sam Harris and Bret Weinstein and Eric Weinstein and others, and Dave Rubin as well, all over the globe, the different places. And recently, it all fell apart. He had to close it all down because he wasn't paying some of his speakers, and so then some of them were dropping out some of the speaking engagements, and so then he ended up having to cancel some of his speaking engagements, and then he wasn't refunding people who bought their tickets. And it's like, I don't know what the heck, did the guy have a coke problem or something? He just, don't take that as an accusation. I'm like, dude, where'd the money go? So he had to close it down. So it's a shame. There was a bunch of these talks, but you notice all the talks, aside from the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris one, but even Jordan Peterson is not a Christian, at least not an avowed one, not a self-confessing one or a creedal Christian. So they all were pretty much focusing on the ones in the intellectual dark web who were still atheist or critical of religion. And so you saw in their discussions an attempt to gain back territory and get control of the dialogue and the narrative. And I was getting a little worried about where things were going with that. So, whereas you have people like Dave Rubin, even though I don't agree with his value system at all, for the most part, he'll interview all sorts of people. He's had some actual conservatives and Christians. He's had Bishop Barron on there. He's had just a real variety. At least people who care about free speech issues. You won't see a lot of hard, left-wing people on his show anymore. But he'll get a variety of people on there. You got Paul Vanderklay, who we call him the pastor of the intellectual dark web. He will interview all sorts of people, and I love those interviews he does where you see different perspectives. And what you see with his stories is a lot of people who were coming from atheism, got introduced to the ideas that Jordan Peterson's been presenting, and have now an interest in Christianity, and either return to Christianity or exploring it for the first time, or they're at least open to it and they're less critical of it. So you have that going on. You have the guys at Rebel Wisdom, who they'll interview a variety of people as well. And it's not just focusing on a few types. It just bothers me. Even as I love Jordan Peterson, but we can't make him we can't deify him. You got to be careful with some of the people out there. So I like seeing a variety of people's voices being heard and put out there. So anyway, this interview, this whole part, reminded me of a panel discussion from literally a year ago. It was November 2017 that this was released. And it was a panel discussion with Jordan Peterson, Bret Weinstein, and Jonathan Pageau. So Jonathan Pageau is that Orthodox icon carver that I made a video about recently. Bret Weinstein, I've mentioned him a few times. If you don't already know who he is, he's an evolutionary biologist and professor, or former professor, at Evergreen State University in Washington? Yeah. Was this 2016? It was shortly after the whole Jordan Peterson Bill C-16 thing happened that he had his own run-in with leftists. And Bret is from the left. Evergreen is probably the most left-wing progressive university in the States as far as their curriculum, and I think it's a state school. So it's like, yeah, your tax dollars are paying for that. Like really progressive, and it's got a really weird grading system. I think it's kind of really unusual. So this is his world, but they would always do this day of absence to sort of help people grow an awareness of racism, where all the, I think it was voluntary, but all the black, I don't know if it was students and staff and faculty, would leave campus for a day just to help people grow in their awareness of how much we need them and the contribution that they had to the college community. Well, this one year, it was 2016, I guess, they wanted to make it a day of absence for all white people, force all white people off campus, which doesn't quite deliver the same point. It was more to just, I'm not sure how it was going to be, because if your idea is that there's already white privilege, then and your message is when you have people leave a campus to show their contribution by their absence, then why would you want all the white people to leave if you think they're already the ones who contribute everything, or the majority, and people already take them as being the ones in power? So what their point was clearly more of a, let's punish the white people. And Bret spoke out about it. He's like, this seems like actual racism. And it was an email I think he sent out that got released, and there was a huge group of students that weren't even his students that demanded he leave, and it just turned into madness on campus. Like, they're literally roaming the campus looking for him to hurt him. So the place just melted down because he disagreed with this idea. I think you could look up the videos and the articles about that whole incident. It was crazy. So he's no longer a professor there or anywhere at this point. But that was what brought him into the limelight, and also his brother is pretty well known. I think he's in Silicon Valley. He's an economist, Eric Weinstein, and it's Eric, his brother, who's the one who coined the term intellectual dark web. So anyway, that's Bret Weinstein. So they're doing a panel discussion on truth, some higher ideas, and most of it's Q&A. Most of the questions were pre-planned. So I remember watching this interview last year, and the one question came up because, as I've been mentioning, there's been people who will normally not even give Christianity a second thought, who now, because of all this stuff happening, are reconsidering. So the question was asked, are we experiencing a Christian Renaissance? So let me play that part.
Do you believe we are experiencing a Christian Renaissance?
I have no idea. I mean, all I can account to is my own experience in this field. I know that for the past year, I've been taking on this crazy journey that I didn't expect at all, and by now I'm getting emails every day, and the emails are basically there's a pattern. The emails are the same, and I have a vague religious upbringing, and became an atheist, Sam Harris style, in college. Discovered Jordan Peterson, realized religion isn't stupid. Discovered your videos and thought, wow, okay. And now, like, I want to go to church. And it's like, I don't know, I have no idea. Like, I don't know what numbers those represent. Like, I don't know how many people write me and how many people who are going through that don't write me. But for sure, as a person, I believe that to dive back, I mean, that I stake my entire life on this. Being an icon carver and talking about the things that I've talked about tonight are completely related together. I believe that the underlying grammar that was developed in Christianity, especially in the first 1,000 years, the underlying relationships of symbols is like an algebra, and it's like a mesh through which we can look at the world. And I think that to recover that to the extent that it's possible is one of the solutions out of our morass. And so I've staked my life on that. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a surprise to me when I learned, say, 30 years ago, that our cognitive architecture and our perceptual architecture were grounded in this grammar that Jonathan referred to, and that there's no escaping from it. You can either understand it or not understand it. If you don't understand it, you live as a mess of internal contradictions, and that paralyzes you in many ways. You're a house divided within itself. These archetypal stories, let's say Christian or not, but certainly they're Christian insofar as the West is a society predicated on those stories. They're inescapable and of ultimate value. Because they lay out the patterns. This is actually the point of them. They lay out the pattern of being that enables you to maintain nobility and sanity in the face of suffering and evil. Now, if you don't believe in suffering or evil, then, well, you don't have a problem, but you're not very bright if you don't believe in those two things. I mean, you're naive beyond belief. And you need an antidote to those forces, because they'll tear you apart. And the question is there an antidote? And the answer is, well, there's a best path forward anyways. And the idea that the best path forward has something to do with shouldering your cross and taking responsibility for your own malevolence there isn't a better answer that anyone has ever come up with than that. So now, are we experiencing a Christian Renaissance? I have the same feeling as Jonathan. Who knows? More than a year ago.
I should probably.
So, this is fascinating, even now, a year after this video, to see. I still don't really know if we're experiencing a Christian Renaissance, but I think some seeds are being planted, and in a weird way, sometimes, at least in the West, a return to patriotism usually coincides with a return to Christianity, and Trump, as polarizing as he is, sort of the whole phenomenon with him is hearkening back to at least patriotism, maybe nationalism, but not necessarily in the negative sense. So you're seeing some people are picking a side. At least you're not seeing people in the middle as much anymore. So I'm not sure if it's going to be a renaissance. I don't know. Everything is still too early to tell. But with what I'm seeing in the discussions online, you're not laughed at immediately for being a Christian as much as you would have been in the past. We still got a lot of progress though to go. So that's because you don't see in the intellectual dark web a whole lot of evangelicals, or God forbid they actually allow a creationist at the table with them, because most of their people who still believe in evolution or an old Earth. I don't even care if you're an old Earth creationist or a young Earth creationist, either one. So it's just there's still some things that they will not find acceptable, and as I'm going on this track, I'm thinking as well about an interview Jordan Peterson did with Jonathan Haidt, where both of them, still so staunchly evolutionist, were mocking the idea of a Christian geologist who did not believe in evolution. So that would just be absurd to them. So there's still this arrogance even in them that they have the right model for interpreting scientific data. So it's interesting to see it. They still have some of their own ideology. It's an evolutionarily based ideology that they're clinging to, but you can't change everything overnight. So who knows where things are going. So anyway, that's Jonathan Bajoux and Jordan Peterson shared their thoughts on whether or not we're seeing a Christian Renaissance. Now we're going to hear from Bret Weinstein the just recently disavowed leftist himself and staunch evolutionist.
I should probably let you go on here so I don't say what I'm about to say, which is going to get me in a lot of trouble, I have a feeling. But maybe we're going through a Christian renaissance, but we shouldn't. It's not a good idea. And that is not to say that there are not a tremendous number of values to be rescued from Christianity, as there are from any ancient tradition that has survived into the present. However, I would say, if there's one thing I'm convinced...
How many ancient traditions have survived into the present? He just sort of throws it in there, like, as if Christianity, what's the difference between that and Islam, even just Judaism? We pair the two of them together, but what if we just had Judaism, like Hinduism, Buddhism, like discounting the huge global and historical impact that Christianity itself has had on civilization. So, a little throwaway comment there. But anyway, I digress.
Convinced of, as an evolutionary biologist who has been very focused on human beings, it is that there is no ideology that we can pull off the shelf that is adequate to our present circumstances. So, whatever it is, it's going to be a 3.0 or a 4.0 version. It's not going to be the version that we have available to us now. And that is not to argue that the versions that we have now are not wisdom from a past era. They just simply aren't up to the challenge.
So right there you see Bret and his acknowledgement that there seems to be a return to Christianity, at least among intellectuals, that there has not been in I don't know when. So he's acknowledging that there's this phenomenon happening, but he really is cautioning against it. It's like it really seems like the secularists, the atheist community is like they're scared of what's happening. That we're going to go back into the Dark Ages. And of course, they have the worst view of the Dark Ages. It's funny because you have Jonathan Peugeot there, and he describes himself as a medievalist, if you see more of his videos. So he is not very much a pro-Enlightenment guy. He thinks it ruined our appreciation for symbols, for deeper meaning. So he's cautioning against returning to Christianity, that's going to remove the progress we made in society. He doesn't specify exactly what he thinks the new version should be. He said it'll be version 3.0 or 4.0 of Christianity, but what would that look like? And who should we listen to determine what that version should look like? Atheists like him? Like, it's funny because what credentials does the atheistic community have in helping us determine, well, yeah, here's how we should move forward? We've been able to learn from a lot of our own mistakes as we've gone through history and seen some of the overreaches of the church. But yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty details here. Exactly what would he change? Our morals? Well, that's probably the one thing we need most at this point, because we're advancing in technology beyond our morals. You look at what's going on with AI, and Joe Rogan has Elon Musk on his podcast recently, and Elon's like terrified of where we're going with technology, and he's like, we got to get government to regulate it. We wouldn't need to worry about government regulating if we had morals in our society already that told people, yes, you may be able to do something, but doesn't mean you should. Now, this kind of point comes up later in this panel discussion near the end, and you really see where Bret and those of his, I don't want to say ilk, but other atheistic scientists and materialists, where they're coming from. So let me jump over to that section.
To something you said on the Joe Rogan Experience. Do you have anything to say?
Oh, glad you're asking that. I was hoping it would come up. So I don't know how many people have seen the video and what it's responding to, but the short version is that I said something on the Joe Rogan podcast about there being different kinds of truth. That I argued for something I call metaphorical truth, that something can be literally false, but it can contain wisdom. And the way you know is that if you act as if it were true, you come out ahead of where you would if you act according to the fact that it's false. And I then said...
So, this is his way of trying to throw a bone to Christianity. That, well, what you believe as Christians is literally false, but it has some metaphorical and ethical value. It's a patronizing way of discussing religion. So, I'll get into it a little more at the end here as far as, well, how do you know that you know what is literally true and what's literally false?
That scientific truth is the top truth in the hierarchy. And the response was that it was arrogant of me to say that there was a top truth, that, effectively, from what position do I do that? And yeah, I can, you want to go ahead and clean that up?
I just want to say that's not the argument. The argument is that there was a performative contradiction in your statement, because you said that factual truth is higher than metaphorical truth. But then to say that there's a top level truth, or that there's an overarching truth, is to use a metaphorical structure to demonstrate where you're placing your truth. And so within the statement, there was a performative contradiction in terms of you have to resort to metaphorical truth to speak of hierarchy, because all the language of hierarchy is metaphorical. And therefore, to place factual truth at the top of that hierarchy is a performative contradiction. So that's my argument.
So I will plead guilty to using metaphor to defend my position, because, of course, language is composed of metaphors, both living and dead, and it's really hard to communicate anything without running afoul of that standard. But I will defend, in spite of that guilt, I will defend the idea that scientific truth is the top truth in the hierarchy. And the reason is really simple. It's because there is no mechanism for sorting between metaphorical truths that belong to different traditions and are in conflict with each other. So, in other words, if we take two, like behave well, when you die you go to heaven. That's cool. You should do that. On the other hand, if you behave well in a Brahman-Atman system, you may be reincarnated as something better than you are now. That's also cool, but it's not the same truth, right? So you can't sort out. These are both kinds of wisdom, and I think we know exactly what kind of wisdom they are, or at least we should, which is if you behave so as to be reincarnated as something better or to go to heaven, what it will do is, in all probability, it will leave your descendants really well positioned in their culture. And that means that your genes, which you might not have been in a position to say anything about, will be well positioned to persist and spread, because your descendants will be well placed. So in effect, going to heaven or being reincarnated as something better than you were are stand-ins for a genetic truth that we can't say. And so what I'm arguing is that what makes the scientific truth hierarchically superior is that it explains all the subordinate truths in a way that is logically consistent. Whereas if you were to prioritize heaven as a truth, then you would have to say, well, reincarnation is therefore false, or you would have to have them all simultaneously be true in some unreconcilable way. So the only one that has the special characteristic of accounting for all the others is the scientific truth.
Okay, so
So did you catch that? So because there's so many, what do you say, metaphorical truths, we don't have a way of determining which of those is the correct one. But they all seem to, this is where he does contradict himself a bit, in that he says they're different, but yet they all serve the same purpose. So, but it's like, what does it matter to you if you don't believe in any of those metaphorical truths? So anyway, he also, this is exactly what Ben Shapiro was talking about in that first clip in the Rubin report, where he reiterates the ethic of evolutionary biologists, in that your whole goal as a human organism is to continue your genetic code. And so, well, that doesn't necessarily lead to any impetus to discover objective truths. So he tries to make the case that, well, then you just will you'll develop metaphorical truths that further that end of continuing your genetic code. But it's like, you hear him explain it, and you have to observe the cynicism in the way he explains it, as if our whole agenda or our whole purpose in life as humans is just to continue our genetic code, just to make sure that we have offspring. It's like, yes, that's part of our call, but to say that's it doesn't affirm that we have some sort of inherent value. It's just like, well, this idea of living righteously so that you can go to heaven, this is metaphorically true because and it has value because it produces a society where your children are better positioned to survive. It's such a reduction of everything. So, not to mention, I don't even necessarily agree with the metaphor he's using. Like, you live well, then you go to heaven. A little more to it than that, but sure.
I'm going to get into this now. So, I think that what you just did was nested your claim for the validity of scientific truth within a pragmatic framework, which is what I claimed when I was talking to Sam Harris was necessary, because you said, I believe, that the justification for assuming the truth of the mythological representation was its effect on something that's associated with the Darwinian process, right? And that's what you used to justify your claim that it was in fact true.
So, in the discussion that you're referencing, my point was essentially that there is something called metaphorical truth and that it's a real thing. So I'm in agreement with you on that. Where we might be in disagreement is that there is simultaneously a thing that I would call literal truth or scientific truth. And by the way, I'm not saying that what scientists say is in this category inherently. Scientists can be wrong, but...
No, but what you are saying is that the only truth could be what scientists end up concluding. If they've come to a consensus and they've explored every other option. Which, even then, he has to qualify that because what science claims has changed quite a lot over the history of even modern science. So, what he is ultimately saying, though, is of all those metaphorical truths, we can't trust them, so the higher truth would be whatever we arrive at through scientific method. But not even that. There's an assumption in everything he's saying, which I'll play a clip in a moment from Rupert Sheldrake, that spells out how the inherent assumption is that there could be no other possible explanation for things aside from what we can observe in the physical world. So it's materialism. So that's their a priori assumption that they never really acknowledge. And if they do, they're just like, well, of course. Because science is limited to that. So scientific truth or literal truth is not really literal truth, it's only scientific truth or empirical or materialistic truth. So it's limited in its options, but yet they might make the case that is the one that's superior to all the others.
The point is truth that is scientifically verifiable, that makes predictions, has a special priority in this hierarchy because it is the one objective version. It is not contingent on being nested in a series of beliefs. So
what if it's...
But if it rules out the possibility of supernatural, then it is not objective. It has a bias toward only materialistic, mechanistic explanations. So
it's a scientific truth that's metaphorically wrong.
Oh, and there are...
Like, I can give you an example. Okay, so I read the memoirs of a KGB scientist, KGB agent, who worked with the Russians in this biochemical lab, and their job was to meld Ebola with smallpox, because Ebola is not that contagious, and so that's kind of annoying if you're trying to kill people, whereas smallpox, but it's really fatal, whereas smallpox is really contagious. So if you could get the two together and then develop an aerosol spray, you could kill a lot of people. And in fact, they did kill about 500 Russians by mistake when some of what they were doing escaped. But it isn't obvious to me that that's an invalid scientific pursuit. But I do think that it's an invalid ethical pursuit. And so that seems to me to indicate that the ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim. So
I'm going to disagree with you. I would say it doesn't supersede with respect to the truth claim. It supersedes with respect to considerations of behavior and policy. So I absolutely agree with you. There are plenty of scientific truths that are deeply unfortunate. And
I want to take what you said, the first thing that you said. Okay.
Actually,
Yeah,
I kind of actually agree with Bret on his rebuttal to his response to what Jordan Peterson just shared, because some truths aren't necessarily recommendations. We can arrive at truths and there's observations. They don't necessarily come with it a recommendation of action. So Peterson was a little bit conflating the two, so I can see where Bret was coming from there. But should we, if we have the ability to merge Ebola and smallpox, should we? So in that regard, yes, we may be able to arrive at a truth that you can, I have no idea if they were successful in it, merge those two diseases. So that may be just a straight up objective truth, observation. Yes, we can do this. Now the real question is, should we go and make it? And that is a moral truth that has to be considered. And really should be considered before we determine if we can merge those two diseases. Before we go through all the trouble of figuring out if we can, we should probably figure out if we should. So that's where I think Peterson should have just stayed with the argument that, well, the decision to explore a certain truth should be nested in the ethical. So, anyway.
if you're good, you die and you go to heaven. If you're good, you die and you're reincarnated as a higher being. Those two things are the same, okay, in terms of their effect. They are restating of the hierarchy. The hierarchy, religion is all about the hierarchy. That's what religion is about. The restating of the hierarchy in those two terms have the same effect in terms of what we're saying, is that if you're good, you will not meld those two things together. And that is the hierarchy. The hierarchy itself is the capacity to be above quantitative, purely quantitative considerations and to apply qualitative thinking. And the whole language of hierarchy is all a language about a movement from quantity up to quality. Like that, it's movement. It's going up a mountain. It's going up the base and then going up to unity. And when you stand in that top place, then you can look down and you can judge what facts, because there is an innumerable amounts of facts. There's an infinite quantity of facts. You can decide which facts are worth pursuing. And so that's what religion is, and that's what the hierarchy is. And so if you take a quantitative tidbit of information and you say that is above, let's say, qualitative judgment, how do you even, why are you even focusing on that quantitative data? Because there's an infinite amount of them. So you have to have a manner by which you focus on something. And that is the hierarchy, and that is the whole language of the religious hierarchy. So
what do you do where religious traditions and what I'm calling metaphorical truths conflict? So let's say mating systems.
And this is the crux of the whole issue, because this is what led to the Enlightenment. It was, you had within the West Catholicism, you had Eastern Orthodox, which was abandoned and left where it was, and so pretty much Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, dominated the West until the Reformation. The Reformation then took power away from the Catholic Church to determine all reality. So then different church movements sprung up all over Europe, and the common man had access to the scripture. And, well, that led to more, well, here's how we're interpreting it. And so you see, whereas the Catholic Church was able to maintain an overarching view and interpretation and application of the scripture and the Christian tradition. But with Protestantism, you saw all these factions developing. So not only was there now a conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, but then within Protestantism, which we have today, we have who knows how many denominations, I forget how many there officially are, but there's so many, and movements within Protestantism. So it got really messy in those years, and you literally had battles, and what made it worse, Catholicism probably paved the way for making it worse, because Catholicism had long before melded government with religion. So a lot of people were making their allegiance to either Protestantism or Catholicism, not for truly religious or spiritual reasons, but for political reasons. So people's motivations are all compromised. So there's all this conflict, and you couldn't quite determine which was the correct interpretation or of truth, whether you're talking about when it came to the politics or when it came to scripture and theology. And so modernism sparked out of that a desire to have a solution to all the chaos that was emerging that would have some non-spiritual, non-religious method of determining which would be the best way to proceed through questions. So let's bring back reason, let's bring back philosophy and some sort of method to make our determinations. So early modernism was not secular. There was still an appreciation for the spiritual, for the supernatural, for Christianity. It was just, we need a method to determine which ways to deal with these conflicts within comparative religion, you could say, and the conflicting truth claims. So let's bring in the scientific method, observation, experimentation, and hypothesis, and just let's use that as our method then to determine truth, to settle the arguments. But it was not entirely secular. It was not atheistic or materialistic even. That was early modernism. Late modernism is what we've been living in for past few hundred years. And that was where, okay, let's just get rid of the idea of the supernatural at all. And probably the last, within my world of psychology, Jung was the last psychologist to actually take religion serious and consider like a psychology of religion. After that, it was like, who cares? We got more and more materialistic that religion was simply discounted. And then it's with the multiculturalists, they started, all right, let's at least consider religion, but not Christianity. You see, there's still a strong disdain in the West for Christianity, which is considered the religion of the West. So let's continue here.
I would argue that monogamy is a superior mating system because it does not sideline any significant population of males. If you sideline a significant population of males by having what biologists would call a polygynous system, or people would generally call a polygamous system, if you do that, then you have sexually frustrated males who are left over and inevitably become something like a marauding horde or an army or something immoral like that.
Now, wait. Now, you're assuming that's bad.
Yes.
And so you're falling into Jonathan's trap, because you're saying, you see, you have this a priori framework that monogamy is better because you've already decided what constitutes bad. You can't help but lay a moral framework over your selection of facts. And so that, I mean, I'm not trying to trap you. I know this is a crazily complicated problem.
Yeah.
But the idea that the fundamental idea is that you can't select the damn facts and order them, which you have to do. You have to do it without applying an a priori moral framework.
Right. So I would say I am applying an a priori moral framework. I am not treating this as we could also look at the behavior of people as a physical process. It's equally a physical process as it is a moral behavioral process. I'm not doing that. I'm being a human being, and I'm saying from the point of view of values that probably everybody in this room would share, it is not desirable to have sexually frustrated young men roving around being violent because they can't find a mate because some other highly placed males in the society have many mates. That's not a good thing. That's not me speaking factually. That's me speaking morally. But my point is not that that's what should come out of this conversation. My point is different religions that contain metaphorical truths differ over what a viable reproductive strategy is. In other words, Christianity prioritizes monogamy. Modern Judaism does too, but the Torah does not. So So your claim is that because it's very difficult to adjudicate between competing moral systems, that science is preferable with regards to truth claims because there's a way of adjudicating between scientific truths. But I would say the mere fact that it's difficult to adjudicate between competing moral claims doesn't indicate, therefore, that science is a higher truth. It just indicates that science has an advantage when it comes to comparison that ethical systems don't. Right. It doesn't mean that ethical systems are perfect. No. So this is one of these places where I don't exactly know what I'm running afoul of and why. I think my brain is built around some sort of model that makes it hard for me to understand why we could possibly be disagreeing over this. My point is, you have 1,000 different belief systems. They're all built out of metaphorical truths and a certain amount of real truth. Let's just stick science in with the rest of them. It's belief system 1,001. Okay, now let's say, well, which of these is best? How are you even going to do that? There's only one of them that has a distinct characteristic. It's number 1,001. What's its distinct characteristic? It explains why all the others work. So how is it not, just by virtue of the fact that it does something that nothing else can, how is it not the top one in the hierarchy?
So right there, science, he says, is a worldview. Science is not a worldview. That's where the confusion is. And this is what gets fundamentalist Christians and just regular old-fashioned Christians riled up, because they'll talk now about science as a worldview and say, science says this, but we say this. And I'm like, no, that only increases the enmity between religion and science. Science isn't a worldview. It's a method. It's a tool for testing out ideas. It's not a worldview. When he's conflating is science and mechanistic materialism. That's a worldview. But scientists have so long been comfortable with being in the position of power to determine which worldview is to be favored, through which they can interpret scientific data, that they lumped the two together. They merged science, the scientific method, with mechanistic materialism. Now, what does that mean? So I'm going to show you another final clip. This is with Rupert Sheldrake, just briefly explaining this, and I'll explain who he is in a moment if you don't know. So Rupert Sheldrake, he's a scientist from the UK, and he got his notoriety in 2013 or something. He was doing a TED Talk, and the TED Talk conference was specifically about controversial ideas. And so he goes to present his controversial idea, and that was a critique of materialism. Because although he's a scientist, he does not buy mechanistic materialism. He thinks there are other ways of interpreting the scientific data. So he's got his own theories. Some of them mesh with Christianity. Some may seem more esoteric and seem to mesh more with New Age ideas or Hindu ideas. He's a hard one to figure out in some ways, because he's I think he claims to be a Christian, but I'm not sure if he would seem like a typical Christian. But regardless, he's a legit scientist who is critical of materialism. So he presented his TED Talk, laying out his points, and what do? They end up censoring his idea, his video. And some scientists, there's like a cabal, I guess, of scientists in the community who are gatekeepers to what's true science and not. And if it's not materialistic, it's not true science. So he ended up experiencing what the intelligent design theorists and creationists had been experiencing for decades. And it's like, boy, we've been the true. I'm not a scientist, like a creation scientist, but I follow their work and of them and the intelligent design theorists, and they've been the true canary in the coal mines. And now, with the far left, finally the comfortable, the regular scientific community is experiencing what we've been experiencing for a long time. But Rupert was also a canary in the coal mine, in that just by challenging the materialistic paradigm, he got all this backlash. So anyway, here's the interview with him.
Something we haven't talked about yet is materialism. And where does this come in? Because it seems like it might kind of go alongside of this scientism, atheism. Does materialism come next? Because, there's a lot of that going on in the world, at least there is on the media channels that I look at on the internet. There seems to be a lot of this. What is your take on that?
Well, materialism has two meanings. Firstly, it's a philosophical theory that became predominant among intellectuals in the late 19th century. And as a philosophical theory, it says the ultimate reality is matter. That's why it's called materialism. Matterism. Matter is the only reality, the ultimate reality. The whole universe is made of matter and nothing but matter. And the matter's unconscious. It works mechanically. It follows mathematical laws. It's completely impersonal. Insofar as evolution takes place, it happens by blind chance and natural selection. There's no purpose in a materialist universe, no God, no guiding principles that are conscious, simply unconscious laws and forces. Well, that's the doctrine, and that became predominant within science in the late 19th century. And as a doctrine, it works quite well for a technological civilization. If you've got a civilization that's all about engineering and machines and progress through gadgets and technology, jet planes, and the internet and smartphones and things, as a philosophy, it works pretty well, but it doesn't work very well if you ask the question, well, why are humans conscious? Why is there any consciousness in the universe? Because if nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious? And in the philosophy of mind, that is called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness is a problem for materialism. It gets rid of God and angels and other forms of consciousness from the worldview, but it hasn't got rid of human consciousness. And some materialists pretend that we're not really conscious. Some pretend our consciousness is just an illusion, but that doesn't explain it because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It's a really big problem in the very heart of science, and there's a lot of thinking about this going on. Consciousness studies are now a very big part of science.
Yeah, where is that right now? How do you explain consciousness or define consciousness or prove it?
Well, I'll come back to that, but I'll just deal with the second meaning of materialism. The second meaning in like everyday speech is where people say, people are very materialistic if they just want to buy things and go to shopping malls and have stuff and are concerned about money and thing. Well, that's the everyday thing, and most people who use it in that sense aren't aware that it's a whole philosophy of nature. But the two are related, because if you think matter's the only reality, then buying stuff seems like the best kind of thing to do.
The ultimate reality.
All right, so with all those videos and all that said, let me summarize my thesis, where I'm coming from, or my argument, and offer what I would say is the solution to this current cultural war crisis that we're in. So first things first, every worldview has two things: a theory for reality, for existence, for the origin of reality and life, and just a theory for the nature of things, as well as a value structure. And these are not arbitrary, they're not unrelated in any way. The value structure is nested in the theory of reality. Okay? So Christianity nests the physical or material world inside the greater spiritual or non-material world. Okay? Whereas modernism, we'll see how it eventually came to invert that. Modernism arose out of the need to settle conflicts between factions in Christendom, primarily over values. So there's one thing, if you watch Paul Vanderkleef's videos, he will say that the current cultural war crisis is a civil war within Christendom. Okay? So with Protestantism and sort of the upheaval with overthrowing the tyrannies, in some ways, of Catholicism, there were all these factions within Christianity, and there needed to be a method to settle those disputes. So modernism is what arose out of that. Well, then what eventually happened is secularism hijacks modernism. So let's use modernism without God in the equation. And then it used materialism as the interpretive lens of all scientific data. So when you talk about science now with someone who doesn't really know much better, they always assume an explanation without any supernatural cause or any supernatural factor at all. So that's the worldview of modern or late modernism. It's a secular world using materialistic lens. See, we tend to equate the two or conflate them, thinking that all science is materialistic. No, not necessarily. Like I said, science is a tool for studying nature. Even is a tool for studying ideas to kind of evaluate them. But with materialism, it limits all conclusions and all data to be factored into the equation to just physical or material data. Okay? In this way, materialism is like a quasi-Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is an ancient idea that was really at risk of corrupting the early church, and it was deemed a heresy. And Gnosticism was this idea that the physical world and the spiritual world, the mental world, are completely separate. And so one of the consequences was that you could do whatever you want with your body. Doesn't matter, because the physical world is already corrupt. It's evil. So who cares what you do with it? You can experience any pleasure you like. The main thing is use your mind to as your source for salvation through the process of gnosis, through knowing, and it's through exploration of ideas and higher learning, you'll escape the evils of this physical world. So it completely separates the physical from the spiritual. So materialism does the same thing. It separates the spiritual from material, but it does something else. Instead of saying that the spiritual has some benefit, it more and more, it just discards the spiritual and emphasizes the physical. So religion gets relegated to the realm of just values and ethics. This is what has happened with secularism. It'll say, let us use a materialistic worldview and lens to interpret the data on reality. We'll determine reality. Christianity and other religions, you guys can determine things like meaning, having a sense of meaning, and it's really kind of patronistic or patronizing the way they think about meaning. It's just as long as it makes something that makes you feel fulfilled. To them, it's completely subjective. So they'll use now two types of knowledge. There's objective and subjective. So the only thing that's objective are things that you can arrive at through science, especially if it's through a materialistic lens. Whereas religious ideas are completely subjective. It's condescending, honestly. So, all right, religion, you guys can help determine things like ethics and morals. But the problem was, with the loss of Christianity's voice in determining reality, because they're connected within a worldview system, your theory of reality and your value structure, you can't just separate them like that. If you diminish the one, you're going to eventually diminish the other. So with Christianity losing its voice in determining reality, going back to, say, the Scopes monkey trial, obviously is where it really, really began in earnest in the U.S. Christianity began losing more and more ground in having a voice when it comes to reality. So that to the point where now we have no voice even when it comes to ethics. I'm going to have to probably do some more videos on this idea. Whereas materialism has its own view of ethics. It starts with Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and people's sensibilities doesn't take too kindly to that idea because they recognize that there are people who are going to be left out, and we know that instinctively, inherently, which is what our scripture supports or predicts, that we have inherent worth. That's the image of God on each person. Darwinism doesn't suppose that. It doesn't offer that as a basic premise. So only those who have worth are those who survive. But we understand that each person, each people group has value, inherent value, not based on anything they can do, but you just have enough worth that you should be valued enough to help that person survive. So as we see people losing out in a Darwinistic survival system, that doesn't sound so good. And it just can be a bit too harsh. So we move into sort of liberalism, which is basically a modern form of hedonism. It's do whatever feels good as long as you don't hurt anyone. And that's what we've been living in. It's been getting more and more. And Christianity for years has been the voice against the excesses of liberalism. But hey, let's make sure that our children are exposed to certain types of content on TV or music. And what was it that we're constantly being told? If you don't like it, don't buy it. If you don't like it, don't watch it. Don't listen to it. And it's funny how the tables have turned, so that now who's the one trying to ban and censor everything? It's now the liberals. So then it's moved from just do whatever you feel like as long as you don't hurt anyone to social justice. The idea of hurt anyone has now expanded. What does it mean to hurt others? It's now expanded beyond just me actually violating someone's rights to now, by me experiencing a good life and others not, they're being hurt by my privilege. So I now have an ethical duty to help others rise up to the same level of privilege that I have. Okay? And really what this is rooted in is bitterness over the promises of materialism being empty. The idea that, because with materialism, if the only thing that can be real is the material world, then that means the only things that have value are within the material world. So whether it's food, money, sex, the most inherent things would be the things that bring us sensual pleasures. Even things like education has a material value. So there's all the material things. We thought that those would fulfill us, but they're not. As well as the outcome was that Peterson talks about this a lot, the Pareto principle, that only a certain percentage will rise to the top and leave a whole bunch of others down at the bottom. So with a materialistic worldview, it leaves people disenfranchised, and with that, disillusioned. And so what has been growing more and more is a distrust now of all ideas from the Enlightenment. And they're viewed now as manifestations of an opportunistic, oppressive patriarchy. Because we look at the data, well, it seems to be men that seem to be at the top. And it's not very nuanced. There's a lot more to say about that. You can watch other videos with Peterson to object to that conclusion. But they will see that a hierarchy leaves people at the bottom, and they're not able to climb up that hierarchy. Maybe not able to find fulfillment in marriage because they are not attracted to the opposite sex. So they're disenfranchised. They're in the margins. I look at this as well, like the distrust of all things, all ideas that emerged out of the Enlightenment and modernism, as an explanation as well for the sudden, weird rise of flat Earth movement. I think at the root is this distrust of science. So who knows how far this will go? But even though the round Earth idea predates modernism, but people are ignorant. So what is the solution? Is Christianity is bringing back religion. And if you want to do comparative religion, fine. Let's test them out. I'm confident Christianity will beat out the others as the one that provides both a foundation for modernism and technology and improvement in society, as well as a bulwark against the abuses of modernism. It's really out of the ideas within Christianity that we are made from and designed by a God who is orderly, who is loving as well, who is inviting and welcoming, as well as just, and who has standards. So you right there get the philosophical foundations for a world that makes sense, and a world that can be studied and understood, and that could be subdued in some ways, and that we have a responsibility to care for it. And also within that, a value system that will care for those who are left out, that have difficulty being included in the different social structures that we have. So Christianity really is the solution that we need to include in these new discussions. So as I've been saying, one of my fears with the intellectual dark web is that we're excluding true Christian voices, because it seems like we're trying to make, it's the It's the modernists, the atheist, secularist, skeptics who are really scared of what's happening with the rise of, it's not even truly postmodern in some ways, because the social justice warrior movement, they're still playing the materialistic game of what's really valuable is things, whether it's power or sexual pleasure or money or security. Those are all materialistic ideas and values. And it's just turning the tables around to include people who haven't been so successful in achieving that. But it's trying to make it so that those who have to give up what they have to help others rise up. So it's a new twist on the materialistic game. It's not true postmodernism, because absolutely true postmodernism would be one that just says nothing's true at all. It's getting there. The transgender idea is really the one that has been threatening the most, because that one is really saying, there's no such thing as gender. Okay? There's no such thing as biological sex, even. Those are just social constructs developed by people in power. So they're threatening the very scientific consensus of what sex is. So that's probably why that has been the issue that we're now finding Christians and atheists and skeptics united, because you realize, okay, things are going too far. But if we just go back to a biological, deterministic worldview, we're going to end up back with the same problem. We have to come back to a Christian worldview that sees the inherent value in each person, and not just based on their groups and their level of disenfranchisement or being marginalized, but sees value in each individual person. So that is how I believe the liberal, secular, modernist worldview spawned the current leftist radicalism. So please let me know your thoughts, your ideas, and please like, share if you do. Share, subscribe, and I hope to see you in the comment section. Take care.